I was lying upside down in the burning wreckage of my car. I could hear the leaking of the fuel tank, and I knew it was just moments before the whole thing exploded in a huge fireball. Just moments earlier, I'd been racing over to my parents' house because I was late for a family dinner. I'd come round a corner too quickly, caught the gravel, lost control of the car, and spun it down the ditch. This scenario didn't take place in reality, but it took place in my mum's mind every time I was a few minutes late to meet her. She would always tell me things like, "Oh, I thought you were lying upside down somewhere dying in a ditch," or "I thought you'd been abducted and tortured to death." This is because my mum was a huge catastrophizer and suffered from terrible anxiety. As her son, I also picked up these habits very early on, and I also suffered with catastrophizing and anxiety. I tell you all this because it's not just me and my mum that struggled with this. Millions of people around the world struggle with catastrophizing, and it leads to untold depression and anxiety. In this video, I'm going to break down exactly what catastrophizing is, what causes it, and I'm going to give you 10 quick actionable steps that you can implement to fix it forever. And stick around, because this is not the usual BS cookie cutter generic advice that you see peddled on the internet when talking about anxiety. This is stuff I had to figure out myself over decades of struggle. And it's worked for me and dozens of my clients from around the world. These steps also link together into a logical sequence to form a system. So if you go skipping around and miss one of the points, you may not understand the overall picture. But if you want to get straight into the action steps, then there are timestamps at the bottom of the video for you to click on there. But before we go any further, let me introduce myself. My name's Ed Barton, and I struggled with crippling anxiety from the age of 4 right up into the age of 32. When I decided to take massive action, I took things into my own hands and I started to overcome it. I was very despondent and disappointed with the advice that I found online which didn't work, which led me to devise my own method to finally overcome anxiety. I was also a monk in Japan, and I used this experience of training the mind with my decades of personal struggle in overcoming anxiety to help others overcome their problems. I'm now honoured and proud to say I work as a specialist anxiety coach, and although living with anxiety was a total nightmare, it has given me my mission and my purpose in life, which is to help others escape the mental prison of anxiety. So with that said, let's dive right into the video. As I mentioned before, I struggled for decades with catastrophizing and anxiety. And this was partly because, as I said, my mother had chronic anxiety and was a big catastrophizer. And also my father was very prone to panic. So I grew up in this atmosphere of anxiety and panic. As I got older, this catastrophizing drove me to be a neurotic overachiever at school. I had a huge fear of failure, and I would catastrophize about what would happen if I failed a test or failed my exams. And that pushed me to study very, very hard. At the same time, it also helped me to develop social anxiety because I catastrophized in social situations. I would misinterpret people's actions and their words, and also jump to the worst possible conclusions, which made me very fearful of people. So right off the bat, I think it's very important that we define our terms. And this includes defining what is catastrophizing. So the habit of catastrophizing is basically thinking the worst. You jump to negative conclusions in every situation, and often they're very extreme, the worst case scenario. So if your friend's plane is half an hour late for landing, you immediately think, oh, it's been shot down by terrorists and they're lying dead in the ocean somewhere. Catastrophizing is also a form of maladaptive thinking, and it is a well-recognized cognitive distortion. And as these names suggest, this is basically a very warped, faulty, and unhelpful way of interpreting reality and thinking about things. So some common examples of catastrophizing are such as the ones which I already highlighted. If somebody is late to meet you, people will often think something terrible has happened to that person. Maybe they've been knocked down by a car, mugged, robbed, stabbed. Something awful has happened to them, and they start going off into a catastrophic spiral of thought. Perhaps you get an email from your boss and you think, what on earth does he want? Oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my job. So you sit there all day getting worried about this meeting that you've got with your boss at the end of the day because you think he's going to fire you. You go there and you actually find that it was nothing of the sort. Or another example might be you sit down in a meeting room, your colleague gets up and moves, and you start catastrophizing, thinking, what on earth is going on? What have I done to Sandra? Why is she moving? Something must have happened. I must have done something to offend her. She hates me now. What's going to happen? I've ruined the whole relationship. This is going to be so awkward. I'm going to have to see her every day and she's never going to speak to me again. You start going on and on and on in these catastrophic spirals. Okay, so then what causes catastrophizing? Now, catastrophizing can often be caused by past trauma. If something very bad has happened to you in the past, then you develop a kind of self-defense mechanism to prepare yourself against the shock of something terrible happening in the future. It might also be caused by fear of failure. If you're very perfectionist and you have an intense fear of failure, this may cause you to catastrophize about your performance on tests and so on. It's also often caused by a pessimistic explanatory style, and we'll come on to this later, but this is very, very important. You interpret events very negatively generally in your life because of this explanatory style. And most importantly, I think it's caused by a lack of confidence or self-assurance. You do not have that inner core of self-belief that you will be able to cope with whatever challenges life throws at you. So you fly into a huge panic. If you get a B on a test instead of an A, you're like, oh God, I'm going to drop out of college and I'm going to have no future and everything's going to just fall apart. You don't have that rock solid inner assurance that it's like, okay, I have the ability to handle what comes at me. If there's a small setback, for example, I get a B on a test, that's fine, I'll make that up. And you just plod forward in a very calm, rational way. If you don't have that inner assurance, then it's very easy to fly off into states of panic. So if catastrophizing is so bad for us, then why do we do it? Well, there are many reasons, and as with all things in the mind, there's always an underlying subconscious logic to it, even if it's seemingly very perverse and self-sabotaging and actually damages us. There is always a logic behind what we do with our minds. So when it comes to catastrophizing, it's often a kind of coping strategy. As I said, if you've maybe experienced traumatic events in the past, if you constantly expect and try to prepare yourself for catastrophic events, then you're kind of inoculating yourself against the shock of that happening again. It's a bit like a broken clock that will still be right twice a day. If you prepare for catastrophic events all the time, then out of the 80 years of your life or whatever, there probably will be 1 or 2 events and you will have been preparing for them. So you're going to be right at least a couple of times. The only problem is you're going to wear yourself out emotionally and cause yourself untold stress, anxiety and depression in the process. And to give a little example of this in my own life, as I said, my mother has always been a lifelong anxiety sufferer. And when she's watching a television program, she will grasp the TV remote very tightly in her hand and lean towards the TV all the time, all the way through the program. And I said to her, why are you doing that? And she said, I want to be prepared for when the commercial break comes so I can fast forward through it. So she will forfeit all of the enjoyment of watching the TV program just so she can be ready to when the shock of the advertisement is there, because she doesn't want that. And that is a microcosm of how she lived her whole life under the grip of very, very intense anxiety, and how I was also living up until the age of 32. So it's a way of kind of preparing ourselves. It's a self-defensive stance. If we're ready for the catastrophe, then we can't be caught off guard. So it is a kind of coping strategy in many cases. It can also be a form of self-harm, like a mental self-harming. This is something I discovered in my own behavior. A lot of the things I did were a way of sort of hurting myself internally. A lot of my intrusive thoughts and my OCD as well around anxiety. So if you catastrophize, it sort of robs you from any pleasure. You don't want to imagine things going well for yourself, because that just feels wrong, because you don't deserve that. Oftentimes anxiety is linked to very low self-esteem. It certainly was in my case. So it almost feels better if we just imagine the worst for ourselves all the time. It doesn't feel right for us to envisage a beautiful, bright future for ourselves. It's much more natural to imagine the worst things happening for us. And then lastly, it can be a bad mental habit and a learned behavior that we pick up. So in my case, all of these were true. And if you have a parent that has grown up catastrophizing and you've been around that, it's quite likely that you're also going to pick that up as a mental model and a way of coping with the world. So people who've been catastrophizing for a long time may think, well, why do I even need to fix that? That's just my way of coping. That's my way of dealing with the world. It keeps me protected from shocking, traumatic events occurring. The problem is that when you catastrophize, it causes a lot of stress on the body and the mind. And these kind of what-if thought cycles that we can get into when we catastrophize, they can lead to panic attacks, they can lead to insomnia, keeping you awake at night thinking, what if the business collapses? What if we've just got nothing to eat? We're all going to end up on the streets homeless. These kind of irrational thought spirals can cause you all kinds of problems and lead to more and more panic and anxiety. As I said, catastrophizing can lead to social anxiety because you interpret everything in such a negative way. If people look at you in a certain way, say something, or they act in a certain way, you jump to a negative catastrophic conclusion for what that means. That can create a lot of paranoid thinking, which feeds into social anxiety disorder, and that's exactly what happened to me growing up. It can also lead to depression and learned helplessness because you're constantly jumping to negative conclusions, seeing a negative version of the future for yourself. So there's very little optimism. It's very hard for you to be hopeful about your future. And of course, it can lead to a lot of physical symptoms and a lot of physical problems. Ulcers, hypertension, heartburn, indigestion, high blood pressure, migraines, headaches, all of these things which accompany panic and anxiety attacks, which are brought on by this catastrophic out of control spiral where you start imagining things going from bad to worse. Okay, so that brings us on to the 10 steps of how we actually go about fixing catastrophizing for good. And the first one, as with all habits of the mind, it is to develop awareness. One thing I learned very early on in my training as a monk in Japan was that we're often not even aware that we're thinking. We're like fish, and our thoughts are the water that we swim in. We just take them for granted. We're so close to them that we never even question it. So you might be so used to catastrophizing that it just feels like a part of you and you're not even aware you're doing it. So the very first step is to just develop this awareness that you are catastrophizing. The second step is to label the catastrophizing, to label the thought. So once you're aware that you're catastrophizing, you can just say catastrophizing, catastrophizing, or I'm jumping to conclusions, I'm jumping to conclusions. Just something to remind yourself that you are actually catastrophizing, and that gives you that bit of objectivity and that distance from the process. Step number 3 is to capture it. So keep a little notebook or a journal of your catastrophic thinking and your catastrophizing, and you can just write down whatever it is. Janine is 10 minutes late to meet me. I'm thinking that she's been hit by a car and she's lying in a coma somewhere. Whatever it might be, just write that down. And what often happens is that once we write our thoughts down, not only does it give more distance and gives us more objectivity on them, they often lose a lot of their grip on us just by being written down onto paper. And that's why journaling is such an effective part of overcoming anxiety. Number 4 is to interrupt the pattern. And this is a concept from neuro-linguistic programming where they talk about pattern interrupts. And if you're very used to this habit and this habitual cycle of catastrophizing, then you need to do something to cut that cycle. So perhaps your habit is to lie around on the sofa on a Saturday afternoon and think of all the things that can go wrong, how you might lose your job, end up on the streets, not have any money to eat, and all this kind of stuff. In that instance, you need to break this cycle by doing something which shakes you up on a physiological level. So go and jump in a cold shower. Go and take a run around the block, take the dog out for a walk, go for a bike ride, preferably something physical because these have all been top-down cognitive approaches. Number 4 is a physiological pattern interrupt. So you just need to do something which breaks the whole pattern and shakes up your nervous system, because when you change your physical state, you change your mood. Number 5 is to practice self-care. And I know this sounds like common sense, but it's obviously not common practice. If we're in the habit of catastrophizing, it can make us very depressed and lethargic. So we're used to lying around on the sofa in a low energy state, eating bad quality food to try and give us a dopamine lift. Try and give yourself a nutritious meal, get hydrated, get quality sleep, because this will change up the way that you think. The quality of your inputs and the quality of your sleep will change your actual way of thinking and the quality of your thoughts. So although this sounds basic and obvious, its importance can't be overstated. So please make sure you're looking after yourself, not just lying on the sofa, eating lots of Pringles and thinking about worst case scenarios. Because when you put all those sugary foods and those simple carbohydrates and those additives into your body, that has an actual effect on you. Even just lying down on the sofa, keeping your body in that posture has an effect on the quality of your thoughts. Please make sure you are looking after yourself, because you can't expect to have high quality thoughts if you're not consuming high quality nutrients and getting high quality sleep. Step number 7 is to reframe catastrophizing. And this was something I figured out quite late on in my anxiety recovery. What used to happen was I would have catastrophizing thoughts and I would try to fight them or push them away. For example, if I was driving my car on the freeway, I would be overtaking a car in the outside lane and I would suddenly think, what if I drive into the central reservation and my car just explodes in a ball of flames? Or what if I get sucked under this 18-wheeler lorry and I get crushed to death? And I used to try and fight this and think, no, you're going to make this happen. This is a self-sabotaging, catastrophic thought. But what I realized that actually this is a signal from the amygdala, which is just trying to make you more vigilant. It's just saying to you, there is a possibility of risk here. This is a dangerous maneuver. You're doing 100 miles an hour. You're overtaking a car in the overtaking lane. Be careful. So instead of freaking out and thinking that I was trying to sabotage myself or hex myself, I learned to just actually thank my brain and say, okay, I see the risk, I get it, thank you. It's not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I am being more careful. I used to also get this if I was carrying a tray of drinks through to guests. Maybe I'd have like 10 gin and tonics on a tray. And I would have to go down the steps from the kitchen and I would get an image of me tripping and smashing all these glasses into my face. And I used to think, oh, that's terrible. That's an intrusive thought. That's catastrophic thinking. I'm trying to sabotage myself. But what I realized is it's just a flicker coming through from the fear center of the brain saying there's potential to trip and drop these expensive glasses and maybe hurt yourself. So I just learned to actually take it as a welcome reminder to be a little bit more vigilant and a little bit more careful, rather than thinking it was some kind of terrible self-fulfilling prophecy, an intrusive thought, and some kind of self-sabotaging thought that I was trying to jinx myself with. Step number 7 is to question your irrational fears. Try and really objectively look at them. So for example, if your friend is 20 minutes late to meet you and you're thinking they've been abducted by terrorists or they've been smashed to death in a car accident, just think about this, like what is the actual probability that that would have happened? What's the chance of them being abducted by Al-Qaeda terrorists on a Saturday afternoon in Nottingham? So you can just use a little bit of rational investigation to think, what are the actual percentages of that? How many plane crashes are there every year? My friend's plane is half an hour late coming into land. What are the chances that that is actually a catastrophic plane accident or that they've been shot down by terrorists? So just use a little bit of rational investigation and critical thinking to actually just question these irrational fears. And step number 8 is the natural follow-on from this, which is to offer more rational explanations. So your friend is 20 minutes late coming to meet you in town. So instead of thinking they've been abducted in the middle of the afternoon by Al-Qaeda terrorists, you can perhaps offer a more rational explanation, which is there are roadworks just on the edge of town. It is particularly busy in town today. There's every chance that my friend is still looking for a parking space. She hasn't brought her phone to message me because she can be a little bit forgetful like that sometimes. So try to offer more rational explanations for what may be happening. Number 9 is one of the most important steps, and that is to change your explanatory style. When you catastrophize, or you are a catastrophizer, most likely you have a pessimistic explanatory style. And this term was coined by Martin Seligman, who's the grandfather of positive psychology. This basically means you have a very pessimistic or negative way of interpreting reality, of explaining what happens to you in the world. So really you want to shift to a positive and optimistic explanatory style. And this can be done in many ways, but I'll put a link to the book below called Learned Optimism, which was a massive part of my anxiety recovery, and I recommend it to the majority of my clients. It's incredibly useful. But in changing to a more optimistic explanatory style, there's a method which Martin Seligman talks about called the ABC method. A is for adversity, B is for beliefs, and C is for consequence. So the adversity may be that while you're giving a presentation, the audiovisual equipment breaks down. Your belief might be, I can't do this speech without having backup slides. I'm going to fail and this will be a nightmare. The consequence is that you don't deliver the presentation well, and then you fear future presentations and avoid giving them. So the alternative way to deal with this using the ABC model, the adversity is that the audiovisual equipment breaks down during your presentation, but B, your belief is that I'm well prepared and I'm an engaging speaker and people will still get value from my presentation anyway, so I'll just continue as planned. And C, the consequence is that the audience engage well with your points, they enjoy the presentation, you grow from the experience, and you look forward to giving future presentations. Another important part of the pessimistic explanatory style are the 3 Ps, and these are personal, pervasive, and permanent. So for example, if your colleague gets up and moves away from you during a meeting without explaining why, the first P is personal. You personalize it. You think that must be about me. I've done something. Maybe I smell, or this person doesn't like me. I must have done something. It must be about me. Secondly, we say that it's pervasive. That means This affects all areas of my life. I am a bad person as a person in all areas of my life. It's not just about this isolated event. I am unacceptable. All people feel this way about me. And the third P is that it's permanent. You think, I'm a loser, I'm socially awkward, I'm like this. This is how I was born and this is how I will always be. So in developing a more optimistic explanatory style, we flip those three around and we start looking at how we can make them less personal, less pervasive, and impermanent. Number 10 is to use some ancient wisdom. And catastrophizing and this negative mental habit has been written about for generations and thousands of years, right back to the Stoic philosophers, and philosophers like Seneca wrote quotes along the lines of, I've suffered many catastrophes in my life, but many never happened. So there's this idea that we torture ourselves in our minds, but these things don't ever happen. Also, philosophers like Michel Montaigne and writers like Mark Twain have all written and joked about similar things. So quotes such as this one from Seneca, a man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary. And also this quote from Michel Montaigne, there were many terrible things in my life and most never happened. These can give us some solace in our times when we're catastrophizing and just remind us that we're not alone in this struggle. And some of the greatest minds throughout history have also struggled with this and recognized it as an unhelpful thinking pattern, but we really need to let it go. If you're struggling with other unhelpful thinking patterns that's leading to more anxiety and social anxiety, then check out the other videos on this channel here and also here, and I'll see you all in the next video.